Hey guys, Henning and Morten from FlippedNormals here. In this video, we are going to show you how to get started with Blender if you are an advanced 3D artist. We found that a lot of Blender tutorials are for very beginners, which is pretty frustrating if you've been doing 3D for a few years. So if you are looking to get into Blender and you are not a pure beginner, this is the tutorial for you.
Yeah, we have a full series if you're just getting started with 3D that we advise you to check out. But if you have used Maya, Max, or Cinema 4D, whatever it is, beforehand, this is the tutorial for you.
We are going to start with the navigation. That is Shift middle mouse button to pan around. It is Control middle mouse button to scroll, or you can use the scroll wheel up and down. And it's a middle mouse button just to rotate. When you open up Blender, you also see this cube here, which this is just the default one. You can customize Blender to your heart's content. We also have 4 different areas by default. We have a general 3D view here. We have the timeline down here. We have all the properties. We have scene properties, which are not in color. This is stuff like render settings. And then we have item properties, which are here, which are the ones in color.
One thing to also just keep in mind that I want to throw out there really quick is that, yes, you can customize Blender to your heart's content, but we would advise you to stick with the default Blender hotkeys. They have implemented something called industry key mapping, but we find that most tutorials still stick to Blender hotkeys, so you'll be better off just learning the Blender hotkeys that are in there by default.
We can also go into the different orthographic views. If we hit the tilde key, or depending on your keyboard layout, the key which is right above your tab key and below your escape, here we get up this little pie menu, which allows you to go into the different views like this. We can also hold our middle mouse button and Alt and just drag to the different views. I don't find this to be crazy intuitive, but some people really prefer it, so that's really personal preference.
One of the big things when jumping into Blender that you might have to get used to, but becomes really, really powerful once you do, is to realize that it's all sort of gesture-based. So you hit a key and then you can do that operation immediately. So once you start getting a hang of that, Blender becomes really intuitive.
The up axis is also Z, just for reference, which is quite useful to know. We can delete objects by hitting the X key. Now you just see this nice little confirmation toggle. So just click delete and there we go. And we can create new objects by hitting Shift A. This is where all our object creation is going to be. Most of the time, we probably want to just stick to a cube. If you want the cube to have UVs, you click Generate UVs. This is the same for all the other primitives as well.
Yeah, and this little quick menu that pops up here, it'll disappear again once you click away from your mesh, but you can get this up again by pressing F9.
But keep in mind, if you do something else like moving it, now F9 is going to bring up the last tool used. So there is no way to have live primitives like this.
Yeah, once you've done one other action, that primitive is now, it's like you've committed to it being this way.
We also have two separate modes we need to talk about. That is object mode, and we have edit mode. All your transformation, scaling, rotation needs to be done in object mode, and your general manipulation of the object, like all the modeling, is done in edit mode. So if you want to toggle between these, you just hit the tab key, and this takes you into edit and object mode.
So it's really easy to identify which is which. If you're in object mode, you'll just see normal cursor like this. As soon as you go into edit mode, it'll be this crosshair cursor.
You can also change our object properties over here, or rather our translation, location, and scale, which is, this is under the object context right here.
Yeah, one of the cool things about this is that you can just reset them all, and you have a really nice easy access to just reset multiples at once, or if you wanted to modify multiple at once as well.
Yeah, we can just hit the backspace to reset whatever was done to this. So backspace and hover over and you reset the values. If we go into edit mode now, and now we try to delete something, you are going to see that we get up a menu for this. This might be a bit unusual. So here you see we have delete, and then we also have dissolve. What you want here depends on what you actually want to do. So if you want to delete this face entirely, you go to delete and face. But let's say we have an edge loop here. We'll cover how to do that in a bit. And you want to delete this one. You don't delete the edge loop. You dissolve the edge loop. You dissolve edges. The hotkey for this is also Ctrl X. You're going to use this a lot, so you have all this and you want to just get rid of it, Ctrl X, and this deletes all of it. Then we have selection. we select with just left mouse button. Be sure to be in edit mode for this. And you just click whatever you want to select. This is true for objects, verts, polygons, etc. We also go into vert, edge, and poly mode up here as well. So you can click them, or you can click 1, 2, and 3, or you can click Shift 1, Shift 2, and Shift 3 to have all enabled. I don't find this to be crazy practical, but maybe for certain tasks like retopology it might be useful. Usually I just go between 1, 2, and 3 to switch between these two.
Yeah, I find it to be more confusing to have all modes enabled at the same time. Even for retopology personally, I will just go into the mode that I need to use at that time. But I guess that, that changes from person to person.
In order to select multiples, like multiple polys for instance, we just shift click them. And in order to deselect them again, we just shift click the exact same one again. Let's just add a loop here. If we want to select an edge loop, we now alt click on the loop. This is very easy when it comes to edges. It's a bit more complicated when it comes to polygons. If we want to select the polygonal loop going down here, we need to hit the Alt key and click on it, but we need to click on it down here. If we were to click on it over here, it would select the loop going horizontally. So if we want to select the loop going down here, we click on the bottom area. And now if we want to select going around here, we click on this area. This is a bit confusing in the beginning, but once you've been playing around with it for a little bit, it's going to be second nature in no time. If you want to select multiple loops, we just hold on Shift and Alt, and then we just click on where we want them to be. This is also how you deselect loops as well. You just Alt-click on this in the same method as you selected it. If you want to select everything, then you can just hit the A key, and if you want to deselect it now, you can hit Alt-A. Alt is generally associated with doing the opposite. So you're going to have a lot of this where you want to hide something, that's H. If you want to unhide it again, it's Alt-H. So the Alt key is very useful.
Yeah, and we're throwing a lot of hotkeys at you, and that is probably one of the biggest hurdles of getting into Blender. It is something you're going to have to suck up, but once you start to commit these to memory, working in Blender is going to be really, really fast.
Yeah, just embrace that. Just embrace the hotkeys. Then we can select rings as well. That is Ctrl, Alt, and then click. Then just clicking on the ring you want to select, and that's going to select the entire ring. We also have the selection tool up here as well, where we have between select. Select is allows you to just select it, but it also allows you to drag it as well. So if you want to just quickly drag it around, and it's kind of like a tweak tool, then you can just easily do that.
I find this really useful for verts when I'm doing retopology.
Yeah, this is a #1 tool for that for me. You can also toggle between them by hitting the W key. W is just to select it, or it's also to toggle around. We have the marquee select. We have the paint select. This is really, it's called like the circle select, but it really is just a paint select. Keep in mind here as well, this is a slightly one of the idiosyncrasies of Blender. If we have 3 verts selected, and now we select the 4th one, this actually selects the polygon. You can see this down here as well in the bottom right. This is where you can see the selection. Here you can see we have 4 verts out of 12 selected, and we have 1 face out of 9 faces selected. If you want to select through, you have to go into wireframe mode or into X-ray mode. We do this by hitting Shift Z for wireframe. Now you can select through it, or we can hit Alt Z to go into X-ray mode. You also have these keys up here as well, if you want to quickly go into wireframe mode. We also have a mode here as well, which is, you can see up here we have different viewports. So if we have the viewport shading wireframe, here it's set to solid, then we have look dev, and then we have full rendered. We want to work in solid most of the time. The pie menu for this as well is also Z. So if you want to just quickly bring this up, this is where I prefer to work. So if you want to go between wireframe quickly and shaded, you can easily do that as well with Z. We can also select linked as well, meaning if you want to select everything now, let's say we have another one of these, and now we want to select only this guy here to the left. We can hover over it, we can hit the L key, and then we can just select this. By default, it's going to be set to regular, and that's just going to select whatever is under the mouse. It's Shift L to deselect this as well now. You can also see here we quickly duplicated the object. You can do this if you hit Shift and D. This is going to quickly duplicate the object, or rather the polygon selected. It also works in object mode as well. So if you were in object mode and hit Shift D, you can duplicate it. You can see that by default, the move tool is going to be enabled. It just means that you can hit Shift D and just start to move the cursor right away.
But sometimes you don't want this, and this is a general workflow for most tools as well. So if you hit Shift D and you start moving it, you can hit the right mouse button and it moves it back into place. Now it's been duplicated, but it just hasn't been moved. This is the same action you'll use for a lot of your other tools where maybe you want to extrude something, but you don't actually want the extrusion to be moved. You can cancel most actions with the right mouse button.
Let's look into the modeling tools as well. Modeling in Blender is really powerful. We can use the knife tool, which is a general cut tool, by hitting the K key. And this allows you to do multiple cuts down like this. If you want to continue the cut, let's say you want to commit this cut and you want to continue cutting, you can hit the E key. And now you can navigate around like this and you can continue cutting like this. And then just hit E and then spacebar to commit the cutting.
Now be aware, if you're doing these multiple cuts, continuing them, and you then hit the right mouse button, it'll cancel all cuts. So just be aware of that. I've had that happen a few times to me. It's just good to know, again, right mouse button cancels the action.
Yeah, this is pretty annoying when this happens. Then we have join. So if we have two verts like this and we want to join them, we can hit the J key and that will join them. The cool thing about this works across verts as well. So if we have this selected and this selected, then we can hit J key and you can see it just does a straight cut throughout our geometry.
Oh, just a real quick thing actually with the knife tool as well. You can cut outside your mesh as well. So if you like just drag across and then commit that, or you can click on one point and click through another and it'll slice through the mesh there. So it's pretty handy with the knife tool.
If you want to do this though, there's a setting. Right now, if we were to just select through, it's not going to select on the other side. But if we were to check on the bottom here, you can see we have tons of awesome help items here. And here it says Z to cut through. So if we were to hit Z now it's going to actually cut through the entire model. And this just brings us to an important point, which is that the tool help down here is incredibly useful. I use this a lot because the tools in Blender are very complicated, or rather they're complex. They have a lot of power in them.
Very extensive tools.
Very extensive.
So having the little help bar down there, it's actually it's like a pro tip for when you're doing anything in Blender. Just look down there to see what other hotkeys are associated with the tool you're currently using.
You can also grow and shrink your selection. Select the point you want, and then Ctrl, plus, and minus on the numpad. And this brings us to our next tool, which is separate out. So now we can hit the P key to separate, and now we can separate by selection. And that separates whatever is selected into a new object. You can see over here. Then we can extrude as well. So if we were to select our sphere, select some polys, and now we can hit the E key to extrude. Extrude is always going to extrude on the normal if you're in poly mode, or if you're in edge mode, it's going to select based on the screen axis. We can also extrude along the normals as well. If we were to select all of these by Alt clicking on it like this, now we can hit Alt E, and now we have extrude along normals, and now we can just extrude along the normals. We can also bevel as well. If we hit the loop we want to bevel, or the edge we want to bevel, Ctrl B to bevel. This is a really cool tool because you can scroll up and down, and now you can easily change the amount of segments for this. We also have the fill tool as well. This is where if you want to fill in a hole like this, just delete the faces. We can select the hole by Alt clicking on the hole, and now we can hit the F key, and that's going to just fill it in. We can also use a grid fill. If we search for, if you hit F3, we can search. And then we can do grid fill. Now we can just hit grid fill, and that's gonna fill this in. If it doesn't work like this, if it doesn't fill in correctly, you can hit the offset, and that's going to just rotate it around. This is a tool I use a lot. It's really one of my favorite tools of Blender. Then we have inset. Inset is on the I key and allows you to just inset your mesh. You can also do this on individual faces. If we double click I, now it's going to inset individual faces. We can also use the bridge tool. If we were to just select some of these polys, delete them up, and now we can select this entire hole, deselect these guys just by Control clicking on them or Control dragging. Then we can hit F3 and we can just hit bridge, and then it bridges it up. We can also right click, and we have bridge edge loops here as well.
Yeah, the right click menu here is actually very nice because it you have a lot of your tools there. So maybe in the beginning when it's hard to remember a lot of the hotkeys, that can be quite handy.
Yeah, you also have the menus up here as well for whatever it is you want. If you want edge menus, edge modeling tools, we're here. We go to vertex, we are right here, and face, and so on. Really, really useful stuff. There's a lot of power hidden in these menus. A lot of tools which we aren't going to be covering. Then we have loop cut as well. This is the tool we are going to be using all the time, and that is Ctrl R. If you hit Ctrl R, it just gives you like a preview insert, and now you can just click on the loop you wanted to insert the loop into, and now you can just drag it up. Really useful tool. If you scroll up and down, now we can add multiple segments to it, and just click it, and now we can keep moving these left and right.
A really handy tip here is this is where it gets a little confusing with the right mouse button. If you want this to stay in the center, you first hit Ctrl R, position it with the preview, and then you hit the right mouse button, and that'll center or cancel the move, but still continue with making the loop.
So I use this a lot as well, where you make a loop, and then you hit Ctrl B for bevel, just to symmetrically add the loops like this. Really useful stuff. And then we look into the transformation tools. You might have already played around with the tools over here when it comes to move, scale, and rotate. These manipulators are quite recent to Blender, and they're not fantastic. They're very basic in their nature, but it's not really the way you should work in Blender. Let's just delete all this, select this, and then we make a new cube. If you want to be fast in Blender, and this is the way we recommend you to work, is we recommend to stick to hotkeys. And that the hotkey for move is G. So if we hit G, we can start to move it around right away. For rotation, it's R. Now you can see it start to rotate it around. Keep in mind that the further away your cursor is to the actual point, the more control you have. It's really hard to control it if you're doing something very close like this.
Yeah, and specifically with the rotation tool here as well, if you hit R twice, it changes from being screen-based to being more on this local axis as well, so you can manipulate it a little easier.
We can also enable scale by hitting the S key, and then we can scale up and down like so. So this is really powerful, but it feels weird in the beginning because you feel like you don't have enough control over what you're doing. But in order to control what you're doing, we can use this along with modifier keys. So if you want to move this, but you only want to move this on x-axis, you can see up here where you have the axis, just so it's easy for you to see. You want to move this on the x-axis, hit G, X, and now it's constrained to the x-axis. If you hit Y now, it's going to just move it on Y, and then Z is going to move it on Z. So this is how you're going to be doing it a lot of the times. This is significantly faster than using the gizmos over here. So if you want to scale it now on Z, we hit S, C, or Z, and then we can just scale it up here. A sim rotation as well. Want to rotate this on the x-axis, we hit R, X, and now we can start to rotate it. You can also insert a number as well. So if you want to scale this up by 2, we can hit S, and then we can hit the 2 on the numpad, and this scales it up by 2. We can also constrain it by using the middle mouse button. So if you want to constrain this on axis, you can hit the G key to move, and now you can just hit middle mouse button on the axis you want to constrain it to, and then it's going to be constrained to only that axis, and then you can just move it up and down. It takes some getting used to, but it's really powerful once you get used to it. This is how I prefer to work. I prefer more to constrain it with the middle mouse button than I do with actual hitting the axis, because I don't really know what axis I'm on a lot of the times. I have to look over here. Like if you're modeling something at this angle here, I don't actually know intuitively which axis is Z.
Now, one time where it can be really handy with the keyboard is if you want to constrain on 2 axes and not in 3 axes, for example. So if you wanted to scale this cube up, but you wanted to omit the Z axis, you just hit S for scale, Shift Z to not scale on the Z axis, but only on X and Y. That's quite handy.
Yeah, we're going to use this a lot. Same if you want to rotate this, say like 90 degrees, you can hit R to rotate, X to constrain on X-axis, and then we can hit 90, and now it's going to rotate it exactly 90. Feels a bit convoluted, but once you get used to it, this is actually quite an effective system. We can also move this based on the local axis as well. Right now you can see that we moved it around. So, and if we now were to just hit the G key, now it's G and X, now it's just moving it on Actually, that's wrong. G and Y. There we go. So now it's just moving it on the local Y-axis. But if you want to move this on the local axis, we can hit G and double Y. And now you can see it's moving it on the actual local axis here. So that is G, and then double tap the axis you want to have it in local view, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and maybe an easier way to illustrate this, especially in the beginning as well, is you can change the global mode to be local, for example. And that way you have a sort of a live preview of where to move your objects.
Yeah, I find in the beginning that it's easier to stick with the gizmos, but then once you become comfortable with it, you really should switch around to using gestures and hotkeys. If you're rotating as well, we can also constrain to increments. This is going to be constrained to increments of 5 degrees if you hold on the Control key now. Well, this isn't just strictly speaking for rotation. This is for everything. So if we were to now hit G and then Control, it's gonna snap it to every unit we have, which is every grid line, like so.
And you can be more precise here as well if you hold down the Shift key while you're moving something. This applies to, I think, a lot of the input numbers as well. Holding down Shift will let you be more precise there.
Yes, if you want to, for instance, rotate it here and have more control, you just hold on Shift and do that. It's not very practical for a lot of different things, but certain things they will go absolutely crazy
Yeah.
if you just were to move it around like this. We can also do math here as well, which is quite useful. So if you want to like select this and then +2, we can do that. We can also hover over it and hit the minus key, and that's going to do the negative. Keep in mind, I just did a slight mistake. I used the minus key on the numpad. That will actually make it bigger or smaller. It is the minus key next to the backspace key. Also, if you want to apply the transformation, basically just freeze the transform. We do this by being in object mode, Control A, and here we have apply. Here we can apply location, which is just translation, rotation, scale, or all transforms. Certain tools, they go a bit crazy if you haven't applied your scale yet, particularly when it comes to the bevel tool. So if the bevel tool starts to misbehave, just make sure that you hit Control A and then you just apply just all transforms, or particularly scale as well. Then we have proportional editing. That is what's on a lot of software just known as soft select. And we can easily do this by clicking up here. Let's go into edit mode, and we can select an edge. We click this button here, or we can use the O hotkey, and now we can just start to move it around. Use the middle mouse button wheel or use the scroll wheel to change the fall off of it, and you can just move this around. Very useful stuff. This works really well if you use the select tool as well, because now you really have like a nice tweak tool. Particularly useful if you're doing something organic. Then we have the 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is this little guy here, which you have no doubt accidentally triggered by holding Shift and right mouse button, which is going to move it around. This moves it based on a screen space. So why do we care about this? In the beginning, this seems like a really annoying feature because it just seems like it's more trouble than it's worth. But this is actually an incredibly useful feature you're going to use a lot. For instance, all geometry is created at the origin of this point. So if we now were to make a new mesh and just make this into a cube, you can see this pops over here. So if we, for instance, now want to make a new piece of geometry right there, make a new cube here, a new cylinder or something, we can do this by moving the 3D cursor to this point. If we hit the Shift S key, Shift S gives us tons of options for the 3D cursor. So now we can do cursor to selected, and that's going to move the 3D cursor to the selected point. We can also hit Shift S and cursor to world origin. I use this a lot because when I accidentally move to the wrong point or I just need to reset it, then you do that as well. So now if we were to make a new object, make a new mesh, let's make a new sphere. Now you can see this is perfectly in this spot. We also have some options for it over here as well. If we go to the view setting here, now you can see that we have the 3D cursor right here. So we could also reset it right here. So we could just backspace over it, and that's going to reset the cursor.
And if you don't see this menu, you can hit the N key to bring up the view and the tool menu here.
Yeah, same here. Speaking of that, if you want to see this menu as well, and you accidentally hidden it, and this is just the T key. So T for the tools and N for sidebar. Also, this is speaking of UI elements. If you were to If you want to expand the view, you can hit Ctrl space to do that. You might have accidentally done that just hidden it, and now you're wondering what the hell's going on. So there we go. Ctrl space, and we're back to normal. Now we also have the transform orientation up here, which we briefly talked about. This is where we just switch this from local to global as well. We also have different views like view, and which is purely screen based, and we have normal as well, and we have 3D cursor. I really just go between normal and local here.
Now, one thing that's really helpful in here is you can set a custom axis. For example, if you want to move your object along a rotated face, for example, if you select that face and hit the little plus icon here, it'll add the face as the new pivot for your transforms, and then you can start moving things along that pivot.
Yeah, so now if we want to move we want to move the sphere up based on this exact angle. This is very easy to do. Again, we select the face, then we hit the plus button up here. And then for the object we want to move or rotate scale around it, then we just set this as a new orientation.
And the cool thing is you can define multiple of these, so you can store them. So let's say you have multiple objects in the scene, you can store multiple of them, and then you can always switch between these depending on which one you want to modify based on.
Yeah, really useful stuff. We can delete them by simply hitting the delete button there. We can also access this menu by hitting we can also enable this menu here by hitting the comma key, and this gives us up the different transform orientations. We can also change the pivot point as well. The pivot point in Blender is different from what you might assume a pivot point is. The pivot point is simply the point where it scales from. Like right now, this point here in the middle is the pivot point. The pivot point you might know from a different software, which is a fixed point you define. That is called an origin point, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Just for now, know that a pivot point is different in Blender. So here it's set to median points. So now it's just going to scale from the actual median point. We can set this to individual origins as well, which is going to scale up from the individual origins. And we have active element as well. The active element is always the last selected element. You can see this has a brighter color around it. Well, this is like a darker orange. This is like a brighter orange.
And if you want to change the active element, you can simply just shift select another element, and it'll switch between those two.
And the hotkey for this is the comma key, the period key, and comma key for the other one. So here you can set it to be 3D cursor. So if you want to scale based on the 3D cursor, you can easily do that. That is why the 3D cursor is so practical, because now we can go into edit mode, select a point, Shift S, cursor to selected, and then we can just scale based on this point here. Let's delete these guys, and let's talk about the origin point. Every single object has an origin point, and you can see this. Let's just set this back, and you can see this in the center of the object. Here you see a little orange dot, and this is the origin point. This is incredibly important because a bunch of things in Blender really depend on this point. One of the important things which depends on it is the modifiers. So if we were to go to the modifier context here, we see this on the right if we were to just click on the little wrench icon here. And now we can add, for instance, we can add a screw modifier to it. And then we set the amount to go up like this. Now, where it bases its origin is based on exactly this point here. So if you want to move this point around, you can't really do that directly right now, at least. I believe this is something they're working on, but currently in 2.8, you have to move this around using a more convoluted way. So we can move this to a point by, let's say we want this point to be right there. We want the origin to be at this point instead. We can now select the point, Shift S, and then we can do cursor to selected, and that moves the cursor to this point. Then we go into object mode by hitting the tab key, and now you see we have an object UI element here with a bunch of settings. Now we click origin, or set origin, and then we can set this to origin to 3D cursor, and now you can see that the origin point has been moved to this point here. And this completely changes the effect of this screw modifier. So the origin point is incredibly important to know how to reset as well. One common thing which happens is you were to let's say you're modeling a sphere like this, you move this around in edit mode, but the origin point is still over here. So if we were to rotate this now, it's going to rotate based on the origin point. So we can move the origin point back by selecting the object, going to object up here, set origin, and then origin to geometry. That's going to move it to the center like this. Then we're going to take a look at how we can change the hotkeys. So Blender is insanely powerful, but it can be even more powerful with the right hotkeys. We can change this by going under Edit, Preferences, and we go under Key Map. And this is where we can change a bunch of hotkeys. So here, by default, you can change which one is selected. By default, you probably want this to be selected with the left mouse button. Right mouse used to be default before, but that's weird. And then we can also set the spacebar action as well by default. Hitting the spacebar is going to play the timeline. We can also set this to tool, which can give some nice little tools as well. I don't find this to be super practical, but it could be handy in certain cases. My preferred method is to set this to search. So now whenever I hit spacebar, we get up this search menu. Then we can also search for different hotkeys as well. We can search for the feature. So we can, for instance, we can set this to local view. And now we can change a hotkey for local view. Which also brings us up to what is local view. Local view is what you would often call something like isolate selected. And it's quite convoluted to bring up because it requires you to move your hand a lot. So if you were to, let's just duplicate this, we can actually see what's going on. This is on the slash next to the right Windows key, or it's on the slash on the numpad. So you can see there are two problems here. First one is you're going to move your hand a lot away from the mouse. And the second one is it actually moves the camera as well. So we can disable all this. If we were to now set this the numpad slash and open this up, we can now just click here and press a different hotkey. I'm going to set this to the slash, which is right above the left Windows key. This is just a really intuitive key. Or if this one is taken, I recommend that you use something like Alt-Q, because it's an easy key to get to. We just press here, and then we hit the key we want, and there we go. And now you can see that this now works by hitting the slash key. And we also want to disable frame selected. But now we have a very functional local view. You can also search here directly for keys as well. If we were to now just set this to key binding. Now you can, for instance, write Ctrl and F. Now you can find everything which is set to Ctrl F. So if we were to hit a key and you're trying to set some keys and you're looking for conflicts, just make sure you're not overwriting something. Then you can just see if there is anything here, which is, for instance, Alt-Q, which in this case, Alt-Q is perfectly safe. So I recommend that you set a lot of custom hotkeys if you're using Blender in like for production or for whatever use case you might have, but be aware that it's a good idea to try to not overwrite a lot of the default ones. It's going to be very hard to follow tutorials, at least in the beginning. Then we have the outline as well. The outliner is over here. This is where we have our scene collection. Now this looks very similar to what you might experience in Maya, where you have a collection which looks like a group, and then we have different items in it. Now, this is not the same as in Maya, in the sense that there isn't really a hierarchy here. If you were to have something be a hierarchy of something else, let's say you were to have like now you can't just move the collection around. Like if you have a group in Maya, you can easily move the group around, but this here is a visual representation of the scene, and doesn't really do much more than that. It's more like a rendering system than it is actually like a grouping system with hierarchies. We also have some options here as well for filters. Filters are amazing, particularly the selectability here and the disable and renders. I prefer to have both of these enabled. Here we can disable the selectability of a certain object, and then it's no longer going to be selectable in the viewport. And you can also change the renderability as well. I really recommend that you particularly have this renderability enabled, because if we were to hide something now, it's not hiding it in the render, which means you might have like the light here, you might hide the light, but it doesn't hide a render. So now it's still going to contribute illumination. So there's so often when you're rendering something in Blender that the viewport looks completely different from the actual render because of this. So just make sure that you toggle the eye for viewport and you click the camera for render. If you want to move something into a new collection, we can easily do that as well. we can select these two guys, and we can hit the M key. M for move to collection, I suppose. Collection. We can click a new collection, and then we can name it here and call this spheres. The cool thing about collections as well is it displays what's inside of them. So here you can see we have two meshes, and here we have a light and we have a camera. We can also customize the UI. This is really one of the strengths of Blender, and it's super powerful. It means that you can essentially make the interface into exactly what you want at the current time. So if you want to make this into like a render view, for instance, we can easily do that. The way you do it is by going on the top here. You see at the corner of every viewport, or every area really, that's like a rounded area. So you can just drag that out, and now you can drag out a different viewport in this case. And then top left, we can now change the editor type. So if we want to set this to something like an outliner again, we can easily do that. If you need more control, we can set this to an image editor where you can now render into. So there's a bunch of power in this. If you want to drag this down like this and split it in half again, you can just do this. So now you can set this one here to be a 3D viewport, and you can set this to be an image editor. And these work independently of each other. So you can set up one to be look dev, for instance, and this one here to be shaded or X-ray. And you just have a bunch of power in this. If you want to remove the viewport, you can right-click on this line between the viewports where you move them, and then you can hit Join Area, and then we can just move the arrow key up, and we can do the same thing here, Join Area, and just move the arrow to where you want to join it. Put this to solid again. Let's look into the camera as well. The camera in Blender is a bit finicky in the beginning until you know how to wrestle it. So if we go into the camera view, just by hitting the tilde key or the button above the tab key, you see we now have a camera view here. If you were to rotate now, you can see that you go out of this view right away. This was really frustrating for me in the beginning, but it has a really easy fix. So if we go into the camera view, and then we go into the view item over here, and then we have view again, so view and view, and then we have lock camera to view. So now we can see that this is now locked to the view. One thing which is frustrating is that you don't really have viewport undos when it comes to this, so make sure that your camera is locked. The way you can lock your camera is if we were to go into the main collection here, select the camera, and now you can see we have the transforms for it. And now we can simply just click on the little lock next to the attribute and just drag down, and now the camera is fully locked. This is incredibly frustrating if you don't know how to do this, because otherwise you will just accidentally move the camera all the time. You can also unclick this now if you want to zoom into the view or zoom out of the view. But keep in mind that the moment you rotate, you go out of the camera view and you go into the regular perspective view. We also have the camera attributes down here as well. If you see the green icon, that changes based on whatever is selected. So camera is selected, it looks like this. A mesh is selected and it looks like this. And light is selected and it looks like this. Let's go into the camera and then camera. And here we're at focal length, depth of field, and we have some other options as well. If you want to add a subdivision modifier to our object just to smooth it out, we do this by going into our modifiers. I'm just going to hide this, hit the N key to hide it. We go to our modifiers, and then we can go to modifier, and here we have, does it generate geometry or does it deform the geometry? And since this generates geometry, we're going to go and down here in subdivision surface, and then we're adding this, and here you can choose how many viewport subdivisions it has. This is really cool because it allows you to have a different set of viewport and rendering subdivisions as well.
This is also achievable with a hotkey. Like if you select an object and you hit the Ctrl 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 9, I believe, then you can set a subdivision level, Ctrl 0 to bring it back to 0 subdivisions. And that also brings us on to a point which is viewport smoothing actually. Like if you subdivide something, you still see a little bit of faceting, but you can get rid of this by just right-clicking on your model and just hitting Shade Smooth or Shade Flat if that's what you want.
A little tip as well when it comes to this is if you want this to be, if you want auto smoothing to be enabled, meaning that you can control, the smoothing will be controlled by the angle. You can set this to Shade Smooth, and then we can go under the object context here, and then we can the object data, and then we can go to normals and we can hit auto smooth. Obviously you aren't really going to see it because we have a sphere. But let's show that on a cylinder instead. It's auto smooth, and nothing is going to happen because it's set to flat and this hit shade smooth, and now you can see that we've smoothed the normals.
But keep in mind this is per object, so you need to do this per object.
You can also change the angle here as well. So I find 30 to be a bit low, so I would set to something like 40 or 45 degrees. Then let's look into how we can assign materials. We are making a lot of spheres, so let's make a donut instead. The way we can assign materials is if we go to the red icon down here, which looks like a checker ball. If we click this, now this is where the materials live. If we click on new, now it's going to create a new material for us, and you can just change this. You notice though that this doesn't actually change anything in the viewport, and that is because we are in the solid view. In order to actually see the material changes, we have to be in looked at view or in rendered view. Otherwise, there's no way to actually see what's going on. We can also remove the material by clicking the minus key. You can see here it says remove material slot. That is going to not delete the material, it's simply going to remove it from this object.
Yeah, the interesting thing about working with materials in Blender is that each object is basically a container for materials. So you can have multiple materials stored under an object. So you'll have this constant list of all your materials in the scene, but you can just keep adding more and more materials to an object if you want.
You can also see there is some hierarchy to it as well. We can also remove them just by going here. And if you want to assign this material to something else, let's say we have this is a duplicate of this, and this has a different material now. So this has a pink material. If you want to assign this material to this object, we can easily just drag and drop it like this. Or we can now click this material, and now you can see we have all the materials right here. If you want to delete the material, you have to go over to the outliner, and here we have the display mode. And this is just a different way of viewing the scene. Now, if you go to Blender file, this is where you can have an objective view of what's going on in your entire scene. So here you can see we have all the materials right here. And so if you want to delete all these, you can select them, you can select one of them, and then just right click and delete. This is a really good way to have like a proper view of what's going on. You can see all the lights, all the images, all that. Particularly for bigger scenes, you really want that. Then if we want to go back to our collections, we hit this little Blender icon up here now, and we hit View Layer, and now we're back to our collection. Let's look real quick into the shader editor as well. If we go to click Shading, now you can see we have a shader editor. Now, if you're doing anything when it comes to shading, you really need to enable an add-on. This is under Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and it's called Node Wrangler. It's not strictly speaking essential. You can do all the work, but it means that all the work is going to speed up so much. One thing you're going to do a lot, for instance, is assigning images to like a shader here. Now, with the Node Wrangler enabled, we can hit Ctrl T, and now we get up all the things we need. For instance, we have a mapping node where you can change the rotation scale for it. You can change, this is going to be a box, a tube, a sphere projection, and you can change the color space and everything. So Ctrl T is going to save you a lot of time. In order to load an image, you simply just click on Image, and then you can load in an image as well. You can Control right mouse button and drag over the line or the connection point just to sever the connection as well. If you want to add new things to the shader editor, it's the same thing as if you are in the viewport where you hit Shift A, and now you have a bunch of things you can add here. Like we can add a noise texture to it, and if you want to blend these two together, you can add a mix node. So search and mix, and then we can do mix RGB, and then we can just start to mix these two together. And drag this into the color, and then we can just change opacity here. So look dubbing in Blender is really powerful because of the shader editor and also because of the strength of the viewport as well. Very useful stuff. Let's look quickly into lights as well. If you just go back to our layout. Also as a little tip as well, there are different layouts for different purposes. These are just layouts somebody has made, and they look pretty decent for what they're supposed to be, but you could also make your own custom layout as well. There's nothing under the shader editor which you couldn't do in around half a minute. So let's just go here, and let's look into lights. Just set this to rendered. And the lights we have are point, sun, spot, and area. I tend to stick to area most of the time, and you can see here it is. We can scale it up. You can scale up the actual light, or we can go under, just go really close to it, and here you can see the actual size of the area light. We can also change the power of it, just the intensity, and we can change the color of it as well. This is where I find math to be really useful. So instead of just dragging the slider up and down, I tend to type multiply by 2 or divide it by 2, just so I can really just increase it quickly. And then I'll just use the slider just to have fine control over it. Then we have render settings as well. Render settings will live all the way on top here. This is where we have all the render settings. So by default, this is going to be using Eevee, and Eevee is the real-time render engine in Blender, and it's really awesome for a lot of different things, particularly when you're visualizing your scene, or if you want to do like a play blast, or whatever it is we want to do, particularly for preview purposes. If you're doing previs, this is fantastic. We can enable stuff like screen-based reflections here, motion blur, bloom, ambient occlusion, so now it's nice and shiny here. We have some volumetrics as well. But the real strength, at least if you want like full and realistic rendering, is if you change this to Cycles. Cycles is a path tracer and is fantastic. It's a really, really good render engine. And you can change the device here to be either GPU or CPU. We have to set this to CPU right now, or the computer is going to explode when recording. We can also change the amount of samples here as well. Higher samples is higher quality, but also slower renders. When it comes to the viewport, it's set to 32, which gives you pretty nice results, but it's also quite fast. We also have color space down here as well under color management. Blender uses Filmic LUT, which is basically just a tone mapper. It just works quite well at balancing your image. So it's a good idea to keep this on, but this depends entirely on your color pipeline.
One thing you'll notice now that you're doing look dev is here that there's always a default sort of ambient light in your scene, and you can tweak this if you want to apply an HDRI or remove it entirely. You can edit that under this like world editor here.
So if you wanted to set down, you see here there's some ambience here. We can easily change the color to this, set this to something crazy, or you can just disable it entirely. If you want to enable HDRIs as well, this is very easy. We can go under the shading viewport, under shader editor. Here you can see we have object, and we set this to world. And now we have the same node as we just tweaked here. And if you want to plug an HDRI into this, we can easily do this. Remember how we enabled the node wrangler before? Hit Ctrl T. This is going to place this here. And then we can easily plug and play an HDRI into this. And just change the rotation here under rotation and Z. Very easy to set up in Blender. In the look dev view as well, you can also see we have some HDRIs enabled by default. This is just to have like the look dev setup already set up for you. And you can change this if we go up to viewport shading, and you can just change the HDRI right here. Obviously, when you're doing like your full-on look dev setups, you definitely want to be in a proper HDRI, in a proper viewport like this. And since there is no map here, it's going to be displayed in glorious pink.
Yeah, we coordinated with Blender on that one. That was, they're like, hey, FlippedNormals, do you want your colors here? Yeah, definitely.
Then if you want to change your output settings, this looks like the printer because it has all your output settings. This is where you change your resolution, and this is where you can change stuff like frame range, where does it output to, and what format do you output to as well. So that if you want to set, for instance, EXR, you can set this to float half or float full, and what compression is it going to be using. So yeah, that's essentially it for our introduction to Blender. We really hope this year has been useful, and these are the kind of things we would have liked to know when we got into Blender. If you have any particular pains when it comes to Blender and you're transitioning into it, we would love to hear what you actually have a hard time with, so we can make videos on specifically that. So if you want to see more content like this in the future, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and also hit the notification bell to receive notifications every single time we put out a new video.
Thanks for watching. And if you're interested in professional training or 3D assets, 2D training, whatever it is, trying to advance your career within the CG, visual effects, or animation industry, make sure to pop over to the FlippedNormals marketplace and grab something from there.